How's it going, everybody? Just want to give my sort of insight on Node Wars specifically, especially since we're now after the Heidel Ball. I kind of wanted to wait and see before I put anything out on whether or not the Heidel Ball would address some pretty big issues that we have going on currently, at least with PvP. Keep in mind, this is my opinion, so it might be a little different than what others might believe needs to be changed from Node Wars, just because I'm looking at it from my own perspective as an upper end guild. So I kind of want to just be pretty brief in this video. I don't want to spend too much time. So I'm going to go over the Heidel Ball, some of the things that happened in the Heidel Ball, some of the things they stated and addressed. They didn't really do too much for PvP outside of one change, which I'll go over in a little bit. But first, I kind of want to go over some of the good things, which primarily focuses on the new player experience. I think it's pretty good that they're coming out with this hyper boost form of catch up. Personally, I think it's really good, and I'm pretty happy about the fact that players are going to get at least a middle section kind of jump in. I'm hoping it's going to be easy because Black Desert is not really known for being new player friendly. There's a lot of systems in the game that you have to know. So if you're starting off the game, you pretty much have to be using some form of a guide. And it's a kind of a long burn, the game, so it takes a long time. So I'm really hoping that the new player experience will be relatively streamlined and that new players can kind of hop in and within the first week at least be able to. I'm hoping they can at least compete in cap Node Wars and be good to go within the first week of gameplay. I kind of believe that's where it should be at, and if it's not, they should adjust it to that. Bad things about the Heidel Ball. Well, they kind of forgot about PvP in general as far as a scene, and I'll go into that a little more later. Second thing is they added another grind with accessories, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but I believe them adding both AP and DP on the new accessories being equivalent, as far as I know. I haven't looked too much at the actual stats, but I believe we're getting one AP and one DP essentially. That's basically how it's going to be equalized. I think total it's 6 AP, but we're also getting 6 DP, so we're not actually getting more AP than DP, which doesn't really help the current state of the game for uncapped PvP. It's just kind of more of another gear treadmill that we're kind of being put on. So, like I said, it doesn't really help. I was kind of hoping that if they were going to add more accessories, that we would just be getting only AP with no DP, especially with the current state of the game and how unhappy people are with essentially the rock meta, which I'll go into later. Some things that I'm kind of neutral about. Really, the deck change. I like the idea of being able to have one-sided decks. Bit skeptical about the fame part. I mean, I guess it's trying to encourage, if you really want to throw out decks, play the game. Makes sense. I think it's fine. But it's really dependent on how much that 400k fame is, how difficult it is to acquire, and how long it takes to accumulate fame. I've seen the chart on how you're going to be able to achieve fame and the activities you can do, so we'll see if that's good. I mean, overall, the deck change in general, good. The fame, not really sure yet. It's not in the game, so I think it could be fine. Could suck, but I mean, we'll find out soon how bad 400k fame is. Really, outside of that, they didn't really add too much in the ball. Really, new player experience got increased heavily. I think it should be that easy. It should be very easy for it to, kind of hop right into. But no PvP changes, no Node War, no Siege, no nothing was addressed. So, yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe Calpheon Ball, guys. But that being said, I'm going to kind of get into PvP itself, starting with the meta. Oh, man. So we've had the rock meta for, once again, a very long time. It seems like they've tried to handle it in some ways before, but really haven't touched the key issues of it. Previously in the past, we had a lot more damage than we did DP, specifically DR. Evasion has always kind of been very hit or miss, whether it's very strong or not strong at all. Man, yeah, we still don't really have a way to deal with the abundance of DP, and our previous ways of dealing with it is no longer in the game with Misty Haze from Shies, and I don't believe that we really want to go back to Misty Haze meta, because all it means is whoever has more Shies wins. But I mean, right now we're in a tough place. So yeah, I don't think we really want more Shies to be the answer, but it is a good stopgap as far as a way to handle it currently. At least any form of shred would be nice. I think as far as ways to fix it, I've kind of thought about it a little bit, ways we can kind of interact with it. And I've been trying to think of ways to where it doesn't completely nullify the crystals. I know some people just want to see them gone. There's a lot of issues about it or whatever. Me personally, I've heard recently some things about saying cap the crystals, don't let crystals be allowed in node wars and whatnot. I don't really think that's a good solution to it. It's kind of like a band-aid fix. I think there needs to be a different form of solution to this issue. I think it needs to be a multiple, like you really need multiple ways to kind of combat the DP stack. Personally, I think we need to lower the Jin crystal wall. Really, all of them, Jin, Wan, Bon, whatever. They all need to be once again DP lowered on the crystals by at least one. And the reason I say one is because I would much rather them incrementally change instead of, let's just say I'm going to throw out a number, instead of reducing the DR by 10 per crystal, right? I'd rather them do one, and that's a total of 6 less DR for the crystals. But that wouldn't be the only change. I think they need to add or increase our RBF crystals that we currently have, and I think we need to get a new variant of it. I think we need a Node War crystal that we would say spend 25 or 50 metals, gives you a little flame, and you can use the old RBF crystals to get a new crystal that gives you plus 3 AP. And this is including Ulukkas. Now, if you do this, this will give us 8 crystals with another 3 AP, and they can make it specifically AP towards adventurers or whatever. I don't care. But that'll be another 24 AP on top of the 1 less DR from the crystals, which would be essentially giving us 30 AP towards players. And I think this is at least a good start. And then from there, they should really, really continue to track and monitor DR and check whether or not they need to lower, the crystal's value by another 1 or 2, but it needs to be actively looked at, because I think there's a heavy amount of fatigue on people's willingness to do uncapped just because of the current meta. So it kind of puts a hamper on not only open world PvP, which will be hopefully participated in more with the one-sided decks, but also, uncapped node wars, which in my opinion is pretty dead in the current state. Yeah, another thing they can do is increase our DP shred, our DP reduction add-on by another 5, 10, whatever they want to do. And I know they're scared to change certain things like that for PvE balance, but I think to kind of counteract that is just give all the mobs across the game 5 more DP. Like, surely we can add 5 more DP across the board and, kind of give more power to players as far as combating the DP, but there's got to be a way to give us essentially more AP while lowering the DP in current states, because the tank meta is definitely gone on for a while, and I think we need to start actually getting into addressing it in multiple ways. And I think this could be a decent change. You obviously have the percent shreds like Misty that used to exist. So, all right. So now we're going to go into Node Wars. Wow. And Node Wars are kind of mixed bag right now. I think as far as occupation changes that I would like to see, I would still like to see the split still be adjusted. And this is specifically for the uncapped part. Sometimes the T2 cap, I think it splits a little too early, so you end up with regions with like 2 4v4s. I'd really prefer if they split it once it hits kind of around that 10 guild mark and drop it down to 2 5 guild regions instead of the current way, which is split into 2 regions of like 4 guilds. But that's kind of a little thing. Preferably, a 10 split would be nice. I don't think the current way is that bad yet. I still think for occupation they need to get rid of watchas unless you own a fort. I think there's just way too many structures. There's double FT plus watcha and an elephant all basically defending a little small section, and then guilds start moving up their FTs, which I think isn't that big a deal with just the FTs and the LE, but when you add the watcha, which is when you're fighting on, let's say, the last fort and there's 4 guilds left, there's 4 guilds all shooting the fort with the watcha, you're just not really interacting with players in that sense. So biggest thing for occupation, I would just like to see the watches get removed unless you own fort. That way it gives at least fort owners an extra advantage, I guess. They don't really need that big of an advantage, but it kind of gives a reason to maybe try to take a fort so you can drop a watcha. But yeah, as far as for standard construction, wow, I think there's a lot really wrong with current construction, and it might not necessarily be the game mode itself, but rather the power creep, movement creep. And it's something that I wanted to address in my last video, but I kind of left it out. I mentioned it a little bit, but the biggest change really to Node Wars, in my opinion, over the past few years is movement creep, specifically with horses. Man, horses are probably the biggest crux to Node Wars currently. I think we have way too much mobility. We can get across the map really in, I'd say average, if you're about 300 to 500 meters from an enemy fort, you can be within their fort within probably 10 seconds. So, and that's kind of a low end, really. 10 seconds is probably from the time you spawn. You press R to get on your horse because it spawns with you, and then everybody has a T10, so you just immediately start flying straight to the enemy fort. You dismount next to their fort, and that's all within a 10-second window. And really the only way to combat that is to build 800 meters out, which will increase the runtime to around 30 seconds, 40 seconds, which makes it a little easier to kind of handle the current zombie meta that we see in Node Wars. But it kind of makes it a little more unfun than Node War, because flags are kind of weak. Flags can get one pushed, especially if there's the enemy has a Hwacha shooting it, for instance. There's a lot of base spots where the Hwachas can shoot incredibly far because they're on the high ground, and there's not really many flag spots. So, you have a Hwacha shooting your flag, an elephant stomping on it, and it, you know, if you lose your flag, you're basically down a 10-minute cooldown, and you have to start running back on horse all the way across the map. So, there's kind of good and bad to that. But personally, I would prefer the Node War slowed down a bit. And horses are definitely the biggest mistake as far as movement creep we've gotten, and it hasn't really been addressed. And structures are incredibly weak. There's a reason why I would say from the lower end fights all the way up to the high end fights, if you really want to win the war, you kind of don't interact with humans. You just get on your horse, you fly over, you hit the base, die, you do it again. They're kind of zombie meta, but horses kind of make it possible for multiple reasons, because over the years we've gotten some good changes as far as like quality of life, at least at the time. But currently, I think changes like the horse spawning with you at your fort, for instance, or at the flag, I think they can be good. However, it kind of makes it so that one of the previously most important structures in a node war was a supply, because you could pull out your horse. And if you were able to stop enemies from moving by killing the supply, you essentially locked them in their base, which was a viable strat. Currently, you can't really do that, for one, because you spawn with your horse, and two, Krogdalo. So Krogdalo gives you the opportunity to have 5 horses, and I think for a lot of upper end guilds, maybe not the lower end guilds, but a lot of the upper end guilds, I'd say the majority of members at this point in the game have a Krogdalo. And I'll use mine for an example. I have 2 Peggies, essentially. I have the T11, and I have a T10, and then I have a Unicorn, and then I have 2 Voltarions. So with that, there's at no point in the war am I ever out of a horse. I can be anywhere, in the fight, basically, because all I have to do is open up my Krogdalo, pull out a new horse, and I'm across the map. So you don't really need a supply, that often in a node war. You spawn with your horse, you have 4 backup horses if, your main one goes down. So really, the pace of the fight is just so much increased because of the diminished utility provided by the supply. Like, supplies are kind of cosmetic for the most part. You kind of use it at the end of the war when you need to get your horse out because the war is about to end, so you want to grab your horse. You don't even need it to repair anymore, because technically you can pull out your tent during the middle of the war. So really, like, supplies purely cosmetic. I've seen it be used as a barricade. Essentially, you plant it in an open gap, because you don't really need the supply anymore, outside of a couple niche scenarios of buying rebuilds or whatnot. But it's made it, with the strength of horses, how quick you can get across the map. It's a big problem. A couple ways, to nerf it is disable Krog during Node War, force you to only have the 1 horse. Man, I would say slow down horses, but I really don't know if that's feasible. I know in Siege, for castle owners, we have the anti-flying Peggy kind of thing, but I don't know if it would cover enough ground really to affect node wars, to be honest. And even by doing that, it's going to make certain bases uninteractable, really. When people can build on a mountain, the only way you can get up there is by flying. So if you disable flying, some bases might literally never be able to be interacted with, especially in the new region, Ulukita, which I'll go over in a little bit, my thoughts on some of the new regions. But yeah, horses really are probably the main thing in node wars that need to be adjusted, fixed. Bring back supply depots mattering, disable Krog at the minimum. That way, if your horse dies, you need to go to the supply, you need to pull it out, and you only have 1. So, Tears of the Wind, if you really want to revive a horse. but you just can't just pull out one of your 5 horses. I think it might help. I'm not really sure. I do think that the pace of the game, because of horse speed, is incredible right now. There's really no downside to inting because you spawn, your horse is already spawned, you press R, you fly. You get there, you land, you die, you do it again. Kind of rinse, repeat. So that might help a little bit with kind of the zombie meta. I'm not 100% sure, but it's probably a good start to at least implement something along the lines of kind of incentivizing supply depots again, nerfing horse movement a bit. With that being said, keeping structures down really right now is basically done solely by players. I've mentioned this before, but I think cannons are kind of not necessarily useless, but they're pretty close to it. I think it takes too long in the current meta for a cannon to do essentially what 5 to 10 people can do in a fraction of the time. It takes, last time we checked, it was about 50 cannonballs to really, do any sort of damage to an FT. And it doesn't sound like a lot until you realize 1 cannons die instantly. They're a 5-minute cook. And 50 shots, you need about, I don't know. You need probably like a good amount of time to get 50 shots off. You're looking like 20, 30 minutes with just 1 cannon permanently shooting, not being stopped, not being CC'd, not being destroyed. So 30 minutes for 1 cannon. Yeah, I don't think it's ever going to happen. I think most cannoneers in current wars, they shoot, probably anywhere from 1 to 5 shots before they're found, bulldozed in like 2 seconds, and that's it. So I'd like to see cannons get buffed in some form of way. Change it so that you can't just BSR them off anymore, force it to be horse charge or something like that. Or if you don't want to do that, just increase the durability of the cannons. They're too squishy, they die too quick. Even an uncapped 1 DP meme wearing 6 Skittles can just kill the cannon in like 20, 30 seconds, and the player can't die because they're 6 Skittles. So yeah, I don't know. Cannons definitely need to change. They don't do enough damage. They're too weak. Really their only plus side is that technically it's like chip damage. And it stops tappers, I guess. But cannons have kind of been phased out of the game. Outside of like team fights where, you have 4 guilds, so 4 guilds are all shooting 1 cannon, which means 4 cannons are shooting 1 base, but it's kind of like a niche scenario, and I don't think you should balance the game really around these scripted team fights where, us as players are implementing rules to kind of balance it, because the game should already be trying to balance their own game without needing kind of player fixes, if that makes sense. All right. So with that being said, I kind of want to hop into Node War zones. I'm going to try to go through this a little quicker just because it's already getting long. But as far as the Node War zones, we have, the new ones, Ulukita and Edania. I personally think Edania is pretty terrible as far as actual playability for a couple of reasons. One, the node is really big, or the nodes are really big, and there's not a lot of usable spots because there's a lot of roads on the node. For those who don't know, when you attempt to build bases, you cannot build on roads, and for some reason Edania just has a lot of roads. Like every single avenue you kind of traverse is a road essentially. So there's a lot of dead space where you just can't build at all. And there's also certain spots where you probably shouldn't be able to build. There's a couple mountains where there's no ramps. There's no access to that spot outside of being able to Peggy, which kind of makes it unfun to play against. So, you have these kind of wide variety of base spots where either you're on a rock and there's no ramp, you got to climb. And there's always been spots like that, but Edania and Ulukita are pretty bad for them because either you're building on a flat ground basically next to a road where you can't really build fully, or you're on a mountain, a literal mountain where your enemies have to actually fly to get to, or else they can't get to your base. Um, and Edania is, like I said, it's massive. The nodes are huge, and there's a lot of unusable space. There's a lot of kind of dead terrain. I'll use Zephyros as an example of what I would consider to be dead terrain. There's like these little lava pits where you can't really build there. You don't want to use it for PvP because you're getting cooked to a fucking crisp with the debuff. So you really just want to avoid it. But there's a lot of that space in some of the node zones to where, you just don't interact with the areas because it's a detriment to be there. So that's kind of Edania. Ulukita is, wow, Ulukita is something else. It has really bad terrain as far as what I would consider to be fun for people to actually interact with. It's a lot of valleys and then mountains. So, there's a lot of low ground. And then right next to it, there's a just mountain. And so, when it comes to building bases, at least for scripted fights, they ban things like the mountain bases because they're just not fun to deal with. Players can't really physically interact with those bases unless you peggy. There's no flag locations you can use that will allow you to push the base outside of, basically using it as a forward base to spawn and peggy and fly up to it. So, Ulukita has a lot of those really, where there's just mountains and valleys, mountains and valleys. You build on the low ground, there's a high ground where people can group up above you. And if you build on the high ground, then no one's going to push you because the only way for them to get to you is they have to fly there. And that seems to be kind of the theme for Ulukita, is really frustrating to deal with bases. Or if you're in a script, everybody builds on low ground, which means, there's high ground right next to your base that people group on. So in theory, Ulukita seemed like it could be playable, but from a lot of the fights I've been in, Ulukita's pretty unfun, on top of the fact that, once again, guilds are kind of incentivized for just getting on their horse, flying to the enemy base, especially with some of these bases where you literally just have to fly to them, dismount, and suicide it. Just run in, do as much damage you can to structures, do it again, rinse, repeat for 20-30 minutes until someone loses, and then that's your node war for the day. Second thing, we have Serendia Balnos, which have been dedicated strictly to T1s, which I think is a shame that, we don't get T2 Serendia Balnos or uncapped Serendia Balnos, because really those zones are neutral as far as terrain. They're relatively flat. There's really not that many kind of egregious base spots outside of like Krong Castle. Serendia, there's really not too many that I would consider to be overpowered anymore with the current movement creep. Really, it's just Krong Castle that I can think of that's kind of a bit overpowered. But having these strictly locked to T1s with no sort of rotation for, the other player base is kind of unfortunate. I think it ruins, the whole experience for upper end because they're forced to play on Edania. T2s, you're forced to play on Ulukita. And personally, with how bad these regions are for actual player interaction, I'd rather have Kama. And, unfortunately saying I'd rather have Medaya. Medaya has a lot of trash littered about on the ground, places like Elric's or spots like that. There's a lot of hills like Helms where there's also a lot of uninteractable bases, or unfun areas. But really, yeah, Edania, there's just too many roads, too much just unusable terrain that's just like there for aesthetics and like the grind spots. And then mountains and long runs, roads. And then Ulukita is just valleys next to high ground mountains. There's a couple good areas I will say in Ulukita that I think could be salvaged, but there are just so many mountains to where, you can build bases on these mountains, and it just, if you're not running a script, you just, you can't deal with those spots, or if you're running a script, they're banned anyways. So, that's really what I'll say for the node war zones as far as that. Once again, the way they're cut across the board, I I still think they're terrible. I don't know how we haven't, gotten somebody in there to just say like, hey, split the nodes up like this, and this should hopefully kind of make it a little more fun for players to interact with. Um, Something I'll quickly go over before I go to my next topic is I know people want more nodes. I think it's fine to add a node or two for T2. I don't think in the current state of the game we should add any more to uncapped. I think it'll end up just being a snipe node, especially with Edania, potentially being one of the nodes. I just don't want any more into those nodes. Like, just no more. There's really nobody in NA that does it anyways, so like we don't really need more uncapped. For the T2, I think it's okay to add one, maybe two for like a day like Sunday, for instance, or Friday, to add two to those days, and then one for the rest of the week. I know this might be controversial take, especially for lower end guilds, but I personally don't think getting a node for siege qualifiers should be easy, in my opinion, for every guild. And I'll kind of leave it at that and won't go too much into it. As far as node wars, I think people want to see stats change for the capped content. I think players are just, like I said, it's similar to the rock meta and uncapped. People were just kind of over dealing with classes that just, don't want to die. So, especially in capped, it seems like a lot of players are going to favor tanky or iframe heavy classes. We have the Corsair taking no damage, things like that, which is a different topic, but I think people really just want to be able to get kill feeds. And so I believe for really all across the board, including uncapped damage, people just want to see more damage. I think for T2 capped, we should probably get, another 10 AP to players. Don't change the DP, just give people an extra, 10 AP towards the cap. That way there's a little more damage. Players just want to see a little more damage. People want to get feeds. People want to get like 10 feeds. You don't really get, kill feeds that much anymore because players can kind of shrug off the damage, especially with the percent damage reduction, which is, I don't really want to get too much into that. But yeah, players want to be able to, I know it's crazy, but they want to be able to get kill feeds. And I think changing the stats for cap content is very, very important. I think we need to either lower the DR or give us more AP or maybe a little of both for the T2s. For the cap sieges, I haven't participated in them, but what I will say from watching them is people are too tanky, but for a couple different reasons, and I'll probably say the biggest reason, and I probably should go over this for siege, which I'm going to talk about next, but HP cap. I've seen some upper end players have 20k HP, and then I've seen some lower end newer players barely hitting like 12k, and 12k to 20k is a huge difference on survivability. So I think they should really consider capping HP like they do for the node wars to probably around 12k HP. I think that's a decent balance. Increase the damage once again, even for siege. For cap, like I said, I haven't done it, but from what I've watched and what people have told me is people just feel so tanky. They have so much HP that between that and people popping sturdy health pots, it's pretty hard to deal with players by yourself. You kind of need to play specific classes, to kind of deal that amount of damage, which isn't really that fun if you're kind of hampering a good amount of classes that really just don't have that amount of burst or combo potential. So yeah, overall, change the cap, give us a lot more damage, really. I think people just want to see more damage overall. And for, another thing for Node Wars is I think people want to see, I would say, lower capped situations for uncapped. So instead of an 85 man, I think people want to see like a 30 man, a 40 man for uncapped. That way it's easier for guilds to hop into. For T2 wars, I think people want a couple more like 50 mans, so that it's not only 40 mans where you have to exclude 10 more people. So I think kind of making a good balance between the uncapped not being extremely high player cap, because once you get above a certain number, most guilds aren't bringing 65, 70, 85 geared players to an uncapped war, outside of maybe 2 to 3 guilds, at least on NA, that I can really say. And for the capped wars, I think there's a lot of 40s, and I think it's pretty low for participation for players, where I'd like to see at least a couple more 50 men. So, lower the uncapped, allow us to do, 40 to 60 men, and kind of give us a couple more options as far as that. And that could be, done with the extra nodes, specifically for the T2 50 mans daily. If they're going to add 1 or 2 more nodes, give us a little more options as far as the amount of players that can join the content. But yeah, that's really it for that. I'll quickly go over Siege, because personally I haven't done capped Siege, but it looks like a lot of people like it outside of the, I kind of already went over the HP cap, so I wish they'd change that, and then obviously change the damage so people do more damage. So I'll talk about the content that I've done, which is uncapped Siege, and by me saying I've done it, it's pretty much dead. Nobody does it for a couple of reasons. Most of them are like the new changes they've done the past few years. Biggest one being castle gates. Once again, castle gates are useless. I don't know why we haven't gotten gate spawns back. I wish they would give us gate spawns back. I think it's adds an incentive for guilds' willingness to actually push castles and interact with it. Second thing, I think the new once castle owner dies, the siege ends. I think it's, if we get gate spawns back, they should get rid of it. They should just get rid of it. Don't let it end. Make it be like the old format. But on top of that, they have to get rid of the dragons. I think the dragons probably the worst thing they ever added to the game, because guilds don't want to push uncapped already, because it's boring. First of all, you have no gate spawns, and the second you kill the owner, you can't even run a fight after. The siege just ends. But if it's somebody that's been sitting in the castle for a long time, they probably have a dragon. So that means you need at least 3 guilds with players to run it down mid, because you're going to get puffed by a dragon. And then, you take out the castle owner and boom, siege is over. And that's really it. So I think uncapped is terrible. So, they need to make some of those changes, hopefully, to kind of make castle sieges kind of a thing again.